Last time on King's Quest. And now, you're all caught up. Hello again, my adventuring companions. It is I, Noir Reservoir, and I'm returning once more into the fray of Sierra games. I've covered quite a few of them now, having played through the first games of many of the respective series such as King's Quest I, Space Quest I, Gabriel Knight Sins of the Father, and Leisure Suit Larry, Land of the Lounge Lizards. So I think it's once again time to don my crown and venture off once more into the lands of fantasy, and face my greatest foe, stairs. That's right, we're returning back to the King's Quest series with their second foray. After the success of the first King's Quest game, Roberta and Ken Williams worked together to forge a sequel, continuing the adventures of King Graham of Daventry. And forge it they did, releasing a year after the original in 1985 with a sequel, King's Quest II: Romancing the Throne. You'll likely notice that the gameplay is closely familiar to how it appeared in the original first game, where the game uses the keyboard to move and utilises a parser to interact with the environment. You'll also probably notice there's a significant downgrade in both graphics and sound from my last playthrough of the previous game, and there is a reason. You see, in my King's Quest I playthrough, I played through two different versions of the game. The first was the original version I bought on Steam, which was how the game appeared in 1984 with its clunky charms. But in that video, you might also recall that I also played a fan remake, a redevelopment of the classic game made by AGD Interactive, which I consider to be the definitive way to experience the first King's Quest game. So you might be wondering, why am I not doing it for the sequel? Is there something wrong with the second fan remake? And honestly, no. Not a dang thing is wrong with it. Or at least, I don't think there is. The truth is, as of this video, I've not completed that version of the game. And while I admit that seems a bit strange to not include that version in a video to compare it like my last one, I'm going to be fully honest. King's Quest II's remake is a very different experience from its original counterpart. It includes new content. A lot of new content. So much so that when I played through the remake, I realised this would be actually very hard to compare with its counterpart, and I've instead decided to treat it as its own entry. So hold on to your adventure caps because we will be covering AGD's fan remaster shortly, but for now, let's just pretend that doesn't exist. Instead, let's focus on the handiwork of Ken and Roberta's second King's Quest game as it first appeared. After the events of Graham's last quest, which consisted of him retrieving 3 treasures and returning them back to the king, who just so happens to crown Graham as king and dies, suspiciously, with no witnesses, Graham now sits upon the throne, ruler of the lands of Daventry, to which he apparently manages to keep everything in check, and everyone is as happy as Larry. Or at least, that's what they all seem to say. I don't imagine many people would like to argue against their king, who straight up murdered a giant in his last adventure. Peace appears to have come back to the lands of Daventry. However, there is just one problem. Graham desperately seeks companionship in the form of a queen. That's right. King Graham is dealing with a cold spell, and is fully prepared to abscond from his throne in the pursuit of some wicked hot slash. But I mean, also to provide an heir to the throne. But that sure didn't stop his predecessor now, did it? Using the magic mirror, he sees a distant land of Kalima, where a beautiful woman is locked away in a tower, and he vows to rescue her, discarding his crown for his most beloved adventurer cap, setting off to the distant lands of Kalima. And for such a distant land, he sure does show up there quickly, as the game abruptly teleports him there immediately. I'm guessing there's a bit of desperation there. I suppose that the hat isn't the only part of Graham that is blue, as he journeys forth seeking the fair touch of a maiden. At this point, we're dealing with less of a King's Quest game and more of a Leisure Suit Graham game over here. And once again, we're back in the fray of the universe of King's Quest. A world so perilous, the first thing I did was save due to the uncanny methods of being able to get oneself murderized. And of course, one of the immediate things I did was a test to see if I could drown in the nearby sea. And of course I could, because this is a Sierra game, baby. The lands of Kalima consist of 49 screens for Graham to explore, not including interiors or other dungeons. And of course, along these screens are nefarious individuals seeking to cause harm to our beloved adventurer. Like in the original game, as Graham explores, he can encounter fiendish enemies such as the dwarf, who will pilfer some of Graham's treasures if he runs afoul of him, which can result in an unwinnable scenario. Or the enchanter, who casts magic on Graham, turning him into a frog and ending the game. Or this little Red Riding Hood, who is clearly some sort of horrendous fiend up to no goods. Or realistically, it's probably just a little girl picking flowers for her grandmother, but I know these games and I am on to you. But perhaps the biggest threat to Graham is Hagatha, an old hag and the main villain of King's Quest II, being the nefarious old crone who locked away the young woman trapped in the tower, and is very, very capable of causing Graham grief in his quest to spring her from her jail. In order to avoid certain doom, Graham needs to get out of dodge immediately and leave the screen before an enemy kills him, or he is out of luck and will need to reload one of the many saves the player has hopefully been making. And if you've not been doing that, then you're a goddamn fool and you should feel bad. Not all is lost when he runs afoul of these enemies though. In some cases, Graham can encounter a friendly fairy, one of the few things in this world that will not break, crush, maim or otherwise destroy him, and will instead bless him, preventing him from being killed by enemies who will instead simply attack his shield before leaving. Now, for such an epic quest, it does beg the question, what does one do in their exploration for true love? Well, without much information to go on, the player is led to wander around the lands of Kalima with no real understanding of how to reach their ultimate goal and rescue the girl in the tower. It isn't until the player reaches the far east of the map where they find an innocuously placed magical door that will take you to any place your heart desires. And while for me personally this would likely be my local Greggs for a sausage roll and a yum yum, I think Graham would have a different priority, with it leading to his future bride, which sounds incredibly creepy and presumptuous. But unfortunately for him, the snag is that the door is locked with an inscription stating that in order to find the key, they will need to make a splash. And I already did that game, you saw me do it, so give me my goddamn key. This door is an important location in the game, as Graham needs to return here frequently to further his quest for Poontang. But in order to reach this door, Graham needs to walk across a rickety looking old bridge, which in a game like King's Quest should most certainly be cause for alarm. But he's able to safely cross over it. This time. In fact, you might even notice that every time he crosses over, he scores an additional point. But you would be forgiven for assuming this was an easy exploit, because that's certainly something I considered. It may be true that he earns a point for each time he crosses over, but it's also because the bridge is slowly becoming more decrepit each time it's used, and if he crosses it too many times, then the bridge collapses, resulting in poor Graham's death as he plummets down the chasm like a Looney Tunes character. This is what we should already know full well to be a classic example of a Sierra dead end. If the player has made the mistake of crossing too many times, then this can result in the game being made unwinnable in a cruel twist of fate, and sometimes this might even lead to having to reload a drastically far in the past save. Or if you're unwitting and haven't been making different saves, then you'll probably have to return back to the start of the game again. And believe me, nothing makes you feel worse than having to restart an entire game from scratch once again. But with a new goal in sight, Graham's task is now to seek the key to the door, which seems to be located in the realm of water. Of course, attempting to journey into the waters of Kalima's Sea is a very dangerous prospect. After all, you witnessed firsthand just what happens when Graham comes into contact with water. But with the promise of a key to the door for his deepest desires, it's something that Graham needs to conquer. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to involve floundering around in the water itself, as it's at the beach that Graham meets with a mystical mermaid, and after courting the mermaid with a bouquet of flowers, she summons forth a seahorse, allowing Graham to ride it. With the aid of the seahorse, Graham manages to enter the domain of King Neptune himself. But without any means of communicating, it's not very clear on what you need to do. In fact, I actually wandered back to the land where the seahorse vamoosed, and I figured I'd somehow goosed myself, so I had to reload the game. As it turns out, the solution here is that King Neptune somehow lost his fancy trident, which can just so happen to be found haphazardly left on the land for Graham to snatch. If he indeed has brought the trident and gives it back to his imperial fishiness, Neptune gives Graham a bottle containing a meagre cloth, while also allowing him to take a golden key. The very same golden key needed to enter the locked door to Graham's deepest desires. Before leaving, I did try to give my man Neptune some love with a fist bump, but I guess the game decided that common courtesy is not an option. Oh well. With the key snagged, Graham returns back across the rickety bridge of impending death, and finally unlocks the door, preparing to bathe in the light of his deepest desires. But, of course, the game cannot end yet, as Graham soon learns that yet another locked door hides behind the newly unlocked door, requiring yet another key. Figures that finding one's deepest desires wouldn't be so easy. Instead, a new inscription appears alongside this new door, indicating that the next key requires those who seek it to set their sights high. So now, instead of down below in the oceans, the next key is hinted to be somewhere in the skies, and judging from Graham's past experience with heights, such an adventure will certainly be riddled with death and reloaded saves. But let's not worry about that until we get there. For now, the player needs to find a means of transporting Graham up high in the clouds. Unfortunately, such means of transportation can be found in the general store nearby. Here, Graham finds a woman selling an old oil lamp, although she indicates she will buy it for 2 treasures, which fortunately can be found in plentiful locations around the lands, such as in a log. But since it would be a shame to give away all these nifty little trinkets that serve no otherwise purpose aside from score, there is a much preferred method. The old woman explains that our pet nightingale was stolen by the fiendish Hagatha, and that if Graham can retrieve it for her, she would be more than happy to part with the old lamp. And sure, while this is a most dangerous expedition, I would much rather die a horrific death than miss out on hoarding all these treasures like a dragon. Hagatha's cave is a frightful sight, adorned by human skulls and a staggering display of a lack of feng shui. And this is one of the locations where it seems events are randomised upon entry. On occasion, the fiendish Hagatha can be spotted inside, but fortunately when I went, the cave was empty, allowing Graham to snag the birdcage with the nightingale. But if Graham simply picks up the birdcage without taking precautions, then the stupid fuckwit bird starts to sing, which is sure to alert Hagatha. And sure enough, upon leaving the cave, the old hag herself appears as I wasted time trying to release the nightingale, because at this point in the game when I took it, I hadn't actually been to the general store and I didn't know what it was for. And while I probably could have absconded with it with ease, she still managed to grab Graham due to me being too busy typing up the parsers to proceed. Fortunately, due to the fairy protection, she couldn't harm Graham, and she instead left in a huff. I believe that the reason she came at this point was because of the bird singing, which is something that can be stifled. Now sure, we could bring its neck to shut it up, but I feel like the old woman might not approve with a dead nightingale being delivered to her. So instead, the player can drape the cloth from the bottle given by King Neptune to trick it into thinking it's night, allowing it to fall asleep, and for Graham to snag it safely. But honestly, it doesn't seem like it was really necessary to do this, since I avoided Hagatha with ease. But likely, the main reason you may want to do this is the point system at the top, with the act scoring Graham more points. Does scoring more points affect anything in the game? No. But does it give you the satisfaction and affirmation on your success, which is something your daddy didn't show you when you vied for his approval growing up? Sure. With the bird returned with its neck very much still intact, the old woman is ecstatic, giving Graham the oil lamp and shooting him outside, closing the store. The oil lamp is pivotal to Graham's quest to finding the key in the skies. After all, this is a very fantastical adventure, so the lamp is of course magical and contains a genie inside of it, seeing Graham as his new master. But rather than be a genie that can grant just any wish, he instead lavishes gifts upon him like a lustful suitor. Each time Graham rubs the lamp just right, the genie appears, giving Graham a new gift. For the first time, he receives a magic carpet, and for the second time, he instead receives a magical sword. And for the third time, the genie presents Graham with a leather bridle before the lamp disappears. It is this first gift that is truly the most important, as with the magic carpet, Graham rides off across the skies, landing on a mountain blocked by a venomous snake. At least it's very forthcoming with explaining its intentions, but it was not open to me to try to negotiate and telling it to chill the fuck out. At this point, we can certainly do combat with the snake and turn it into some snakeskin boots for Graham to wear to impress his new bride-to-be, using the newly acquired magical sword from the genie. But this is also a King's Quest game, and often these games reward a more benevolent and tolerant approach, even to venomous snakes looking to snack on Graham. So instead of using the sword on the snake, the player can instead use the newly acquired bridle on it, turning it into a winged horse, as it explains that the enchanter turned it into a snake. Now, I've mentioned moon logic before, but this is something I truly think is insane, because who in their right mind would think that this was a solution? I think the only real means of figuring this out is deciding to use the item on a whim, because it was just received. With the curse broken, the Pegasus soars off, although not before giving Graham a magical sugar cube that protects him against brambles. It seems oddly specific, but it is certain to come in handy later on. With the path cleared, Graham continues on and is rewarded by a blatant in-game advert for a future game by the company, Space Quest 1. Oh man, I can't wait for that one. But more importantly, Graham also snags the second key needed to unlock the door back at the rickety old Bridge of Anxiety. But after all that ordeal, the door is unlocked, to reveal yet another door, insisting that the person have a stout heart to find the key to the door. Now what exactly does this mean? Hell if I know. But with our new goal set, Graham sets off to find the third key to finally unlock the door and meet his future bride. and while I couldn't tell you what the task means by a stout heart, I can say that it turns out that the final key is kept tucked away by death and decay, alongside poisonous water that is impossible to cross over safely. In order to reach the castle, the player can meet with a ferryman lying in wait on the shores, willing to take Graham over, at least for a price. And that prize being one of the many fabulous treasures that Graham has amassed across the landscape. But there is more of a cheapskate method. Inside a nearby cottage is the sickly grandmother of Little Red Riding Hood, who is bedridden with an illness. Or at least, sometimes it is, because other times the game decides to stay true to the old fairy tale and have a wolf in Granny's bed instead, who chases after Graham to kill him. But if Graham walks out and back in, Granny's back as if nothing happened, which makes me think that perhaps Granny is suffering from a touch of the old lycanthropy. But as Granny is sick, Graham can kindly give her some hot chicken soup he stole from the dwarf's home. As a reward for Graham's kindness, she lets him take 2 items from under her bed, a ruby ring and a black cloak. With the cloak and ruby worn, the figure is fooled into thinking Graham is someone else, and he's allowed to ride the boat across the water to Dracula's domain for free. Which again draws some concerns on just what Granny's been doing that she seems to be a familiar sight for the boatman. But for now, we can take solace in the fact we safely got across with all of our treasure in our possession, and Graham reaches the exterior of the castle, although it's blocked by poisonous brambles that will kill him if he even slightly touches one. And while the player can skirt around it carefully, the reward for sparing the horse's life makes this much easier. The sugar cube can be eaten, making Graham impervious to poison, and allowing him to more easily walk across the bramble without being horribly killed by its poisonous touch. Now unfortunately, the lake and bramble are only part of hazards blocking the king's way, as outside the castle doors are 2 ghosts that will kill Graham if he gets too close to them. But like the previous puzzles, there is a method to prevent this. By using the same method to trick the ferryman, Graham can don the black cloak and ruby ring, and the ghost will mistake him for someone else and decide to peace out, letting Graham enter Dracula's castle unharmed. Although probably not for much longer. After all, Dracula's castle is filled with some horrible traps, such as stairs that Graham will fall off once again, proving that they are his true mortal enemy. In the depths of the castle is a coffin. Originally, when I was exploring, Graham finds not Dracula, but a gold key to unlock the door. However, sometimes Graham can also find Dracula asleep in the coffin, and he can be killed with a stake. Or at least, that's what I thought. I tried using it on him, and it didn't work, and he killed Graham. Finally, with all the keys acquired, the doors are finally opened, leading to a world that looks oddly like a vaporwave artwork. The finale of King's Quest is located in this realm, but despite it being for his deepest desires, it instead leads Graham to an island with no means off, trapping him with nothing but a fishing net, which he uses to catch a large golden fish. Perhaps Graham's deepest desires are actually just to isolate himself and to take up a simple life as a fisherman. But once the fish is picked up, Graham decides to throw it back into the water, and as a thank you for almost killing it but not quite, it decides to let Graham ride on its back across the ocean, leading to the island where the girl in the tower resides. And on this island is a pretty convenient amulet discarded nearby, bearing the inscription "Home." And if the player happens to type in "home" for the parse, then Graham is whisked away back home to Daventry, but without rescuing the girl. As he walks back to the castle and the game ends, as he no doubt goes for a long cold shower and hopes that at least he got that mermaid chick's number. Instead, Graham needs to grab the amulet and bring it with him to the top of the tower, where he faces off against a guard lion, protecting the room where his bride-to-be is kept hostage. And once again, Graham could decide to fight the lion and slay it with his sword, but this would reward less points to the player, and again, he has a more animal-friendly alternative he can pursue. Instead, Graham only simply has to feed the lion some undisclosed meat that he snagged from Dracula's abode, and it decides to have a little nap, content with the meal it's just had, allowing Graham to barge into the girl's room. Thankful to Graham for rescuing her, the two leave the tower as Graham uses the power of the amulet to return them back home to Daventry, where he's rewarded with a wedding with his new bride, Valanice, attended by all sorts of characters, including Hagatha, the very same woman who locked her away and who has been trying to murderlise Graham this entire game, as well as Count Dracula, renowned fiend and murderer of the innocents, as well as a motherfucking dragon. And with that, the game ends, bringing Graham's latest chapter to yet another close. Wanting to make sure you don't miss out on the next video on King's Quest III to air as human? Then make sure you don't forget to subscribe to Noir Reservoir and click the little bell down there to be kept up to date on all future Noir Reservoir videos. And if you want to help support this channel, please consider liking the video and sharing it with any adventure game aficionados you think will appreciate it. And finally, why not consider following me on some of my other platforms? You can find me on my Twitter, Tumblr, or even my very own Discord server for all the dank memes. I'm sure you won't regret it. Probably. So until next time, my friends, I'll catch you later.